Number 1.
It started this morning. I was taking my daily walk with Brian, a routine we practiced over the last year which consisted of us grabbing coffees from the place down the road right before we went to work. I remember needing a coffee bad. My head hurt in a dull but overpowering way, not unlike a really bad hangover after a long night, except I was sober last night. Brian sat down by the coffee tables, facing the traffic like he always does. He ordered a latte, strange I thought, he always got an espresso, and we went by the process of talking idly as we waited for our brains to wake up. In the middle of our conversation, a song popped up on the radio, Heal the World by Michael Jackson. I love this song, I said idly. Easily one of his top 5. It's a shame, really. What's a shame? Brian replied. I looked at him incredulously. Brian stared at me right back, like I had a tumor on my face. He turned his head as if to check I was serious. After a while, I said, No way. You haven't heard? Haven't heard what? He said. He died a week ago, I said. He flinched as if suddenly taken aback. It was his turn to look at me as if I had something wrong with my face. What the hell are you talking about? He said with a slight wisp of concern. Dude, I replied, don't you watch the news? There was a big funeral and everything. The Jackson 5 were there. Usher cried on stage. He just stared at me with his mouth agape. Carl, are you okay, man? He said. What do you mean, am I okay? I said. Dude, he muttered. Michael Jackson died 6 years ago in 2009. Are you sure you're feeling fine? We burned a couple of minutes of arguing, and it took him a while to convince me that he wasn't kidding, because really, neither was I. I had a dull headache, and my body had a slight case of the shakes, but I chalked it up to a cold settling in. But I really remembered watching Michael Jackson's funeral a week ago. I remember putting his CD on the stereo and turning up the volume to listen to his #1 album once again. It must be some weird prank, I thought. Feeling slightly off, I pushed myself to make my way to the office. Immediately, I noticed a new paint job that covered the facade of the building where I worked. The slightest bit of work makes everything look new, I thought. I went to the grocer downstairs to grab a pack of biscuits to bring to my teammates. They were fiends for cookies and had an endless appetite for sweets. I grabbed the first thing that I saw, the odd blue Chips Ahoy package. Happily, I made my way downstairs. The guys immediately saw what I was carrying up and their eyes lit up happily. Boss, they said, this is why we love you. I high-fived them all as I unpeeled the cookies from the package. The plastic trays were emptied in a matter of seconds as they descended upon the cookies like a happy pack of vultures. As they settled to their desks, Eddie came up to me and said, Boss, what's the occasion? Why the cookies? I shrugged. I like the new packaging, I said. It just caught my eye, you know. Eddie gave me the same look that Brian did. It felt disconcerting. What are you talking about? He said. Oh, you know, they're blue now. It's a good change from the red, I muttered. A flash of anxiety rose up from below my spine. Eddie shook his head, laughed, and patted me on the shoulder. They've always been blue, boss, he said. That's when I noticed that everything was slightly off. A voice at the back of my head was telling me that I was going mad, or perhaps this was some cruel but unusual prank. But every time I remember Eddie and Brian's faces in my memory, I was struck with the feeling that they meant what they said. Things were not as I remember them. A fear welled up from my stomach. I prodded with small questions, trying to fight back the rising anxiety that was threatening to overtake me. Throughout the day, I found out a couple of other things that were weird. I discovered that the office building was new. We just moved into the new office a month ago, not as I remember, which is 3 years ago. I was the boss of my team, and it wasn't just a loving nickname that they gave me. And a couple of other details, too numerous and tiny to be of consequence. But as a whole, that's a different ballgame. I felt sick, nauseous, lost. I locked myself in my office and sent out an email saying that I was sick and would take the rest of the day off, that I would go home until I felt better so as not to spread whatever I had. A couple of my team members replied immediately, expressing their thanks with my decision. I walked home with a rising feeling of discord bouncing around in my head. Everywhere there was something off, something I don't remember being how it was now. The cabs were yellow, not silver. The train service was called PTB, not City Rail. The people who manned the shops were different, not the people I remember. I ran up to my apartment, up the stairs until I found my door. I stepped inside and locked the door behind me. Sweat soaked my forehead. Was I going mad? I felt my phone vibrate in my pocket. I glanced at the screen and flinched. Mother, it said. Hello? I said as I answered it. Carl, dearie? My mother said in a bright voice. Are you okay? Did I catch you at a bad time? I shook my head instinctively. No, it's okay, I said. Tears welled up in my eyes. I felt a lump rise in my throat. How have you been, Mom? I missed you so much. Oh, you sweetie, my mother cooed. What's gotten into you? Who are you, and where did you take my real son? She said, laughing. I laughed with her in relief. Mom, I just really missed you, is all, I replied. I'm glad to hear your voice. We spent the next hour talking about the most insane things, everything and nothing at all. I found that her voice calmed me, made me feel safe. It was my mother being my mother. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was going mad, regardless of how far I pushed that at the back of my head. Because my mother died 3 years ago. Where the hell am I?
Number 2.
My grandfather died 2 weeks ago. After the funeral, my family sat around my grandmother's living room talking about the nice memories we had with him. All of us grandchildren mentioned how we always spoke in different voices when reading, even if it was just a newspaper. We spoke of the stories he used to tell us about his childhood. My grandfather was born in Poland in 1929. He was 14 when his family was captured by the Nazis and taken to Birkenau. He never told us grandchildren what it was like in the camp. We never pushed for him to. From what I understood, he had 2 younger sisters and a younger brother, and as well as 3 older sisters and 2 older brothers. The 3 younger children were killed upon arrival at the camp. During their stay, his family was torn apart. He would never see 2 of his older sisters again. They died after a couple of weeks of being there. His mother also died very soon after they arrived. My grandfather and his remaining family were liberated in 1945 when he was 16 years old. He suffered from major PTSD for the rest of his life. He met my grandmother when he was in his late 20s after moving to America, and they soon got married and had a family. My grandfather seemed like a normal man. He never became senile, not even in his last years. By the time he was in his 60s, he no longer suffered from major PTSD, and by that I mean he no longer woke up every night screaming or feared small spaces or became debilitated with fear anytime he saw a Nazi flag. He was the strongest man I ever knew, mentally and emotionally. However, there was something that my grandfather did that always seemed very odd to me. Anytime we had a meal with him, he would serve an extra plate. Even in restaurants, he would order 2 meals, but he never ate the food on the other plate, and he never let anyone else eat from it. I remember asking him why he did that when I was a kid, and he would always say what he said anytime anyone asked: old Polish tradition. I believed that until I went into college and began studying my background and reading all about Polish culture. I kept what my grandfather always said in mind and tried to do research about this odd tradition, but never found anything. So, as we were recounting our favorite grandfather memories, I decided now was as good a time as any to try to find out why he really did that. I brought it up and everyone began to discuss it, and we all began asking our grandmother if she knew why. She hesitated for a moment, but then she decided to tell us. Birkenau was a very harsh place. They never had enough clothing to shield them from the terrible winters. Everyone was sick. Everyone had fleas. Your grandfather was a smart man. His father before him had served in the First World War and taught the boys all he could about survival in a tough environment. The inmates were not given very much food at all. Your grandfather had an idea to form a pact with a young girl his age so that each day they would take turns getting the food that belonged to both of them, so that instead of every day not getting enough to eat to even make a slight difference in their hunger, they would be full one day and then they fast the next. This worked for a while, but the longer they stayed in there, the sicker they got. Eventually, the girl contracted typhus. She was too weak to stop him. He was blinded by his hunger. He would tell her he'd feed her, but he never did. He kept her food for himself. She was too sick to comprehend what was happening, and shortly after, she died. The camp was liberated soon after that. We sat there dumbfounded before she began to speak again. After the camp was liberated, he couldn't tell anyone what he had done. He was so ashamed. He tried to live a normal life, but his life was anything but normal. He broke down one day and told me that every time he would sit down to a meal, he would hear weeping in his head. That's how it started. But eventually he would see her sitting at the table with him. I thought that this was just his post-traumatic stress disorder messing with his mind, but then I saw her too. She sat at the end of the table over there. She pointed to the long dining table. She wouldn't speak. She would only weep. We could never eat together without her being there. Eventually, the house began to smell of death and sickness perpetually. A coldness took over the entire house, even in summer. We'd find dead animals in the house with bite marks taken out of them. This had to stop. So one day, Abraham got the idea to set a plate out for her at dinner. Conditions got better as he did this every day, every meal, and every snack he had. Eventually, the house no longer smelled. The cold went away and the animals stopped appearing. I also stopped seeing her. We never actually saw her again. None of us knew what to say. Grandfather was skeptical of everything. He didn't even believe in God. And that is in spite of attending the temple every Friday of his life. I guess we all sort of chalked it up to his PTSD getting the best of him. That is, until we all heard the weeping.